I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is Adnan Syed. If his name sounds familiar, it should. He was the subject of the Serial podcast, the podcast which set off the national true crime craze that has really swept and garnered so much energy. But it all started with the Serial podcast and Adnan Syed's case. Now, his case was connected to, obviously, a murder conviction for the murder of his ex-girlfriend. And it's a case that many believe was his conviction an injustice. I said many, but not all. Here's his story. Hae Min Lee was an 18-year-old student at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore, Maryland. On January 13, 1999, her family began to worry when she didn't show up to pick up her cousin at daycare. Police began to investigate immediately, but it wasn't until February 9th that she was found, dead and partially buried in a local park. After an anonymous call, investigators began to focus on Hae Min's former boyfriend, Adnan Syed. He was arrested on February 28th, and after a 6-week trial, was convicted and sentenced to life plus 30 years. It was a case not many people paid attention to until the Serial podcast was released and became a cultural phenomenon. Attorneys tried to get Syed released, but lost every appeal at every level. Then, in September of 2022, Baltimore prosecutor Marilyn Mosby announced she was requesting that the judge vacate the convictions and release Syed. Mosby never spoke with the original prosecutor or consulted with Hae Min's family, but filed the motion that set Syed free. But now, in a shocking reversal of fortune, his conviction has been reinstated, raising lots of questions about his future, the murder of Hae Min, and our system of justice. This has really been and turned into a never-ending saga, and a never-ending saga of litigation inside of the courtroom, with all the twists and turns through the years for a case that dates back to 1999. I want you to take a look at this story from Scripps News Baltimore, Xavier Worry, the reporter on it, because it really zeroes in and focuses on this latest twist in the case.
I would say that there's nothing normal about this case throughout its course from the very beginning of the prosecution until today.
In October 2022, Adnan Syed was released from prison, but it came with some concerns. Young Lee is the brother of Hae Min Lee, the woman Syed was convicted of murdering in 2000. It was ruled Young Lee wasn't treated with dignity and respect because he wasn't given a reasonable notice of the hearing, which resulted in Syed being free.
If the legislature creates new remedies that can affect sentencing and convictions, that it is presumed that there is going to be some sort of notice and opportunity to be heard by the victims unless the General Assembly expressly decides that it is not practicable to do so.
Lee is set to receive a reasonable notice of the new hearing, giving him the opportunity to be heard. After a recent hearing in October last year, Friday's 4-3 ruling means Syed's murder conviction is reinstated for now. Attorney Steve Kepler predicts the next steps.
The next decision, I would imagine, would happen within a few months. What the court said was that there needs to be some coordination with Mr. Lee to give him an opportunity to attend in person, should he wish to do so, to provide a statement, and for the hearing to proceed, and with his attorney to have the opportunity to also present closing argument.
Really a strange scenario that we're in. I mean, I've never seen anything quite like this, but at this point now, with this latest development in the case, brings us to our first question. And that question is an important one, I think, for everyone involved. But most importantly, probably for the defendant himself. What does this mean for Adnan Syed? This latest twist and latest decision in the case. We're gonna need some help for this, so let me bring in our guests. Joining me, the co-hosts of the Prosecutors Podcast, Alice LeClure and Brett Talley with us. Thank you so much both for joining me. Trying to figure out what this means for Adnan Syed. Alice, I'll begin with you. What does this mean? What do you think is going to happen now to this defendant, this convicted killer?
So procedurally, it's actually pretty simple. Adnan was convicted by a jury of his peers more than 20 years ago. And what the Maryland Supreme Court has done is put us in a point in time for when the state filed the motion to vacate the conviction. But nothing has happened, no hearing, and the court hasn't ruled. So now we are back procedurally where he's been a convicted killer, and then there will be a hearing to determine next steps, as should have happened in the first place. And of course, this is 2 years in the coming.
So Brett, is this just going through the motions that we'll have this hearing and it gets vacated again? Can something change here?
I think it can, Vinny. There's a couple things that happened with the Supreme Court. Number one, this is going back to a different state attorney. Marilyn Mosby is no longer there. It's also going back to a different judge. And the Supreme Court said this is more than just you have to have young Lee there. It's more than just he gets to appear. He actually gets to challenge the basis of this vacatur. He gets a meaningful opportunity to participate, and that could be very interesting. We did not see the evidence that this vacatur was based on. All of this was done in secret. It was done behind closed doors. It was done off the record, and then it was presented as a fait accompli to everyone when Adnan Syed was released. And the Supreme Court made very clear that is not how we do things in this country, and it's not how we're going to do things the second time around. So I absolutely think we could see a different outcome. This could be a case where Adnan Syed goes back to prison.
Alice, what are your thoughts? Like the whole thing, the way it happened, as Brett described, was really strange, bizarre. It was done by a prosecutor who was facing her own charges. It was done in a very public way at the end, but not so much moving up to that point. Prosecutors generally don't do this. It was unusual. Do you think this prosecutor will look at things differently, or will look at the way that Marilyn Mosby looked at it?
I think this prosecutor will take a page from what the court has clearly stated in their opinion, which is to say the way the previous state prosecutor did it is not okay with us. It is not okay to not have on the record what the evidence is for the basis of vacating a conviction. Again, a conviction by the jury. And I think this new prosecutor is going to have to look at the evidence, and we're going to hear an adversarial process. We're going to hear young Lee on behalf of Hae Min Lee and the family ask real questions about this evidence. Does it stand up in court? Is it really a basis for a motion to vacate? So like we've heard, I think that this could have a very different outcome this time around, and it will not happen in the cloak of darkness. That is the key. The judicial system is for everyone, and in this case, it should be no different.
Oh, we talk about this all the time, how the victim is a part of the case. I mean, without a victim, there is no case. There's no reason for this thing to even happen. So, Brett, were you surprised by the way this initially went down and the way Adnan walked out and there was a roar outside and the prosecutors trying to give some sort of a statement as all this is happening? It was almost like role reversal. We saw a prosecutor almost acting as a defense attorney.
I mean, look, Vinny, when you have a case where you have a true injustice, it's on the prosecutor to take action. So to that extent, I didn't have a problem with that. But I was shocked at the process. I was shocked that it was done in secret. I was shocked that the prosecutor didn't believe enough in the evidence they were putting forward to stand behind it in open court and present it to the public for the public's view. That's what the court system is all about. This is supposed to be an open process, like Alice said. Now, was I surprised at the response outside? No. There's been a long-running public media relation campaign for Adnan Syed. We all know that. But that should not affect what's happening in the courtroom. What's happening in the courtroom needs to follow the rules. It needs to follow the law, and it needs to respect victims. And in Maryland, there's a very strong victims' rights law. And at the end of the day, what this really was a victory for victims' rights. At least in Maryland, you're not going to steamroll over victims, even if it's popular.
Alice, you and Brett, part of the Prosecutors Podcast. Obviously, we know your background. The relationship between a prosecutor and a victim, to me, is important. It's significant. Like, I know you represent the people of the state or the people of the Commonwealth when you're in court, but you're also bringing a voice for that victim, and to not reach out to the victim's family before all this happens, to me was kind of strange, bizarre, and I'm very skeptical of that.
Absolutely. It's not only rooted in what's right for a prosecutor, it's rooted in rights that victims have within the law, that Congress, there's federal victims' rights acts, there's state victims' rights acts. And that's because the state has stepped in place of the victim's family to prosecute perpetrators. And in this case, absolutely, the victim needs to be taken into account, not just by law, but because of the spirit of what prosecutions are. It is to seek justice, in this case for Hae Min Lee and her family. And not reaching out to young Lee before the hearing was not only against his rights under the law, but again, something contrary to what every prosecutor should do, which is to speak up for victims.
All right, Brett, so just circling back, just to tie this up. So what does this mean for Adnan Syed? This means that his future, I believe at this point, would be unknown. It's not a lock one way or the other.
It's completely unknown. He'll be out on bond until this resolves. So he's not going back to prison tomorrow. But when he walked into that courtroom 2 years ago, he felt absolutely confident of the outcome. They all knew what the outcome was going to be. They'd already set up the press conference. It's not going to be that way this time. And there's a very real chance that he will end up going back to prison. It won't be the first time you saw something like this. There's the Crosley Green case in Florida, which I think you've covered as well. When you get it wrong, when you vacate a conviction, it's just as bad as getting it wrong when you convict somebody. And if this vacater can't stand up in the light of day, then his conviction should remain intact.
Okay, we've got more. Coming up next, where was Adnan Syed during the murder?
A fellow student named Asia McClain, she wrote me 2 letters while I'm house from the Baltimore State Penitentiary, stating that she remembered being in the public library and seeing me there on January 13th, 1999.
Go ahead. Hit me. Bam.
2 celebrities reveal their turbulent relationship to the world.
He was just Hollywood's mega hunk.
The man who beat me up for 5 years.
The general public sees this, and all they see is wife beater.
2 completely different versions of what was happening. That means one thing: somebody's lying.
Victim to Verdict with Ted Rollins. New season premieres Sunday night, 8/7 Central.
Only on Court TV.
I say it all the time, that the job of a prosecutor is to seek justice, and justice is the truth. Whatever it is, it is. You don't change the facts, you don't change the truth to try to get a conviction. What you do is you follow the facts to the truth, and if the truth leads you to a crime, then you prosecute that crime. And in this case, one prosecutor saw it one way, and then a new prosecutor years later, Marilyn Mosby, saw the case of Adnan Syed differently. Here she is, again, speaking publicly about this and talking about the family of the victim, but also the family of the convicted killer.
The fundamentals of the criminal justice system should be based on fair and just prosecution. And the crux of the matter is that we are standing here today because that wasn't done 23 years ago. Although my administration was not responsible for neither the pain inflicted upon Hae Min Lee's family, nor was my administration responsible for the wrongful conviction of Mr. Syed, as a representative of the institution, it is my responsibility to acknowledge and to apologize to the family of Hae Min Lee and Adnan Syed.
So an apology to the killer's family, because she doesn't believe he's a killer. So if she doesn't believe he's a killer, what does the evidence say? What does she think? And it brings me to another question here. And then I think this is an obvious question. If someone's accused of murder and they didn't do it, where was Adnan Syed during the murder if he didn't do it? Right? You'd have an alibi because you didn't do it. So still with me to help me work through all of this, the co-hosts of the Prosecutors Podcast, Alice LaCour and Brett Talley. Brett, it's an important question, right? If you're a prosecutor and you are apologizing and you're vacating a conviction, you should have an idea of where the accused killer, who you believe is innocent, was at the time of the murder. Correct?
You absolutely should. And you also should take into account all the other evidence that was shown to the jury. Remember, at this point, Adnan Syed is a convicted murderer, convicted by a jury of his peers. And if you're going to overturn that as a prosecutor, if the evidence is overwhelming, you have to take that action. That's your job. But the evidence needs to be overwhelming, not speculative. And Adnan's alibi is one of those things that's been speculated about since Serial came out. And as a clip you ran earlier, Asia McClain provides him a possible alibi at the library next to school. But there are several problems with her alibi. And first, you have to assume that she's right about the day, that it wasn't some other day, that she is remembering months later the day that Hae Min Lee went missing is the day that she saw Adnan Syed. But more importantly, she left that library by 2:40. She was gone by then. Two different witnesses, Jen Pusateri and Jay Wilds, testified that Adnan needed to be back by practice. That was the alibi he was looking for, is his practice alibi. Practice didn't start till 4 o'clock. He had track practice at 4 o'clock. So he had an hour and 20 minutes to accomplish this murder, even if you assume what Asia McClain is saying is true, and his cell phone is pinging over Woodlawn High School at around 3:59. So he had plenty of time to do it, and it seems like he did do it.
Let's take a look at Adnan Syed and what he is saying about his alibi and where he was at the time of the murder.
So the state's theory at trial was that the crime took place on January 13th, 1999, between 2:15 p.m. and 2:36 p.m. So myself and Hae, we were both high school students, and this alibi witness also was a high school student, one of our classmates. So the school at the time ended at 2:15 p.m. So after my arrest, a fellow student named Asia McClain, she wrote me 2 letters while I'm housed from the Baltimore City Detention Center, stating that she remembered being in the public library and seeing me there on January 13th, 1999. So my trial attorney at the time, she never contacted Asia McClain. I had given her the information, and for whatever reason, she had never contacted Asia McClain. After my conviction in 2000, Asia McClain provided a sworn affidavit stating that she saw me in the library on January 13th, 1999. And she stated that we had a brief conversation, and she left around 2:40 p.m., and that I was still in the library when she left.
Okay, Alice, your thoughts about, and there he is. I mean, he held that presser last year trying to make his case to the public.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that there's a lot of evidence here. So let's just take what Asia is now saying, and what she said even back then in 1999 is true. She says in her affidavit and in her letters that Mr. Syed mentions there that she leaves the library by 2:40. It doesn't matter. The jury heard evidence that Adnan's cell phone was pinging at a cell tower at 3:15 p.m. around the Best Buy. The Best Buy that Adnan himself said he would take Hae to regularly for romantic endeavors. And we heard about that Best Buy from 2 other witnesses, Jay Wilds and Jen Pusateri. You'll hear a lot of people say, well, you can't trust Jay Wilds because he has problems with credibility. What about Jen Pusateri? She has absolutely no reason to lie. There's been no attack on her credibility, but she tells essentially the same story. So we have Adnan's own actions, his cell phone. He himself tells the police, I asked Hae for a ride after school. Now, later on, he says that Hae never, he never took the ride with Hae. With Adnan's own words, we have 2 other witnesses who knew at the time about this Best Buy, and we have cell phone records backing up the fact that he's also at that Best Buy after the time that Asia McClain says she left the library, hence the alibi. So if there is an alibi, it doesn't preclude the fact that this murder could have still occurred after 2:40, and as the evidence shows that it very likely did.
Let's take a look at what you're referencing here, the cell phone records. This is from the state's motion to vacate the conviction. According to co-defendant Jay Wilds, the defendant lent him his cell phone and vehicle that day. The cell phone was in Wilds' possession at the time of the murder. Wilds and the defendant were together at the time of the burial around 7 p.m. The state relied upon billing records showing the phone was connected on incoming calls to cell towers, placing the defendant's phone in the vicinity of Leakin Park around 7 p.m. The state's contention was Wilds' testimony, coupled with the cell phone records, tied the defendant to the victim's burial site. And that is significant. So it's cell phone and Jay Wilds here. Brett, do you have any problem with the credibility of Jay Wilds?
Well, Jay Wilds has credibility problems. He lied. He is the accessory after the fact to this crime. But what bolsters his credibility is Jen Pusateri, which is someone that Adnan Syed doesn't like to mention. Jen Pusateri picked Jay Wilds up the day that Hae Min Lee went missing. And that day, Jay told her what happened. So before he had any contact with the police, before he would have had a reason to make this up, he's already relaying this story to her.
Thanks so much, Alice Accord, Brett Talley. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation into the case of Adnan Syed, the man convicted of murdering his former girlfriend and then getting set free after his story was profiled on the Serial podcast, a whole bunch of documentaries, all over the place. Everyone was talking about Adnan Syed and his wrongful conviction. Well, eventually he was set free. But then that was sent back by the appellate courts. Here's the story. When the Serial podcast was released, it was a cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, everyone was talking about true crime and a little-known case out of Maryland. Adnan Syed was convicted of murdering his former girlfriend, Hae Min Lee, in 1999. The jury convicted him, but after the podcast, many were questioning the verdict and the evidence against Syed. Suddenly, armchair sleuths across the country and attorneys in the courtroom were arguing for his innocence. It wasn't until 2022 that a Baltimore prosecutor, who herself was under indictment, would make a motion to vacate the case against Syed. She did, and he was released. But then the appellate court reinstated his conviction, making everyone wonder, did he or didn't he murder Hae Min Lee? And that's really the important question, right? So let's take a look back now, because this is a case that was completely under the radar. It was a trial that happened that not a lot of people were talking about at the time. I was working at Court TV at the time. I don't think we covered this one when it happened. But let's take a look at the timeline of events here. And it begins January 13th, 1999. Hae Min Lee goes missing after school. February 9th, her body is found in a city park. Then you move forward a few weeks. February 28th, 1999, Adnan Syed is arrested. And then we move forward to the end of that year. In December, his first murder trial begins, but ends in a mistrial 7 days later. It wasn't a hung jury. There was a problem with a sidebar and some jurors, so they just ended the trial. And then they started again in January of 2000. And that's when Adnan's second trial begins. And he's convicted of first-degree murder by the end of February. And in June, he's sentenced to life plus 30 years. So There was a case, there was a trial, there was a jury. They were convinced beyond a reasonable doubt of his guilt, that Adnan was the man who committed this murder. So that brings us to our next question, which is, what was the evidence against Adnan Syed? Because the evidence convinced the jury, unanimously as always, beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty, that he committed the crime. So let me bring in my guests who know a whole lot about this story. Joining us, the co-hosts of the Murder Sheet podcast, Kevin Greenlee and Anya Kane are with us. And also joining us, forensic death investigator, professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University, and the host of the Body Bags podcast, Joseph Scott Morgan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Anya and Kevin, let me begin with you. And looking at some of this evidence, I mean, this was a trial. Trials, you need evidence. You need to convince people. It's not easy to do. I'm a former prosecutor. I understand that. But there was evidence against Adnan.
There absolutely was, Vinnie. And so the evidence primarily, I would say, kind of fell upon the witness, Jay. So he became a very important figure in the case against Adnan. And then there were other things. There was a palm print found on a map in the back seat of Hae's car. There were phone records sort of tying Adnan to the general location around the park where her body was found. But going back to Jay, what he had to say to investigators and when he was saying it to other witnesses, like his friend Jen, became incredibly important because they were coming out with things like, oh, Hae was strangled. And that was even before the public knew details of her death. So when you look at that and you look at the case against Adnan, it really seems to kind of come down to that.
Okay, let me put this up because this is from the state's motion to vacate. The main pieces of evidence implicating the defendant was the testimony, as Anya said, of cooperating co-defendant Jay Wilds, who testified basically to the following. Defendant said he was going to kill the victim. Defendant admitted to strangling the victim. Defendant showed Wilds the body in the trunk of her car, and Wilds helped the defendant bury the body in Leakin Park. Wilds also directed police to the victim's car on February 28th. Joseph Scott Morgan, that type of evidence, but it's from a co-defendant because he's implicated in the burial of the body. How do you trust that testimony? How do you trust that witness? And how do you figure out, is this guy telling the truth?
I don't know if it's a matter of us in forensics to determine if, in fact, he was telling the truth. However, when you begin to look at all these very specific breadcrumbs along the way, it's quite compelling, certainly from a scientific standpoint, when you are essentially given a roadmap to try to understand the progression and also where specific physical evidence can be found. The fact that was the aforementioned fact that this idea of being thrown around with manual strangulation, this entering into the conversation before this is widely known, is quite glaring to me, because it's not like they're saying this is a ligature strangulation or that it was a smothering or something like this. We're talking about a manual strangulation. And, that was confirmed at autopsy, where that is specifically listed as Miss Lee's cause of death. So for me, from my perspective, that's a big reveal, Ben.
So let me ask you, Kevin, about the level of physical evidence here compared to other cases that you've covered through the years on the Murder Sheet podcast. Would you say it's a little bit thinner or kind of in the norm of the cases that we've seen that have been solved?
I'd say it's kind of in the norm. Obviously, we've all gotten used to watching crime shows on television. We'd like there to be video of the actual crime being committed. We'd all like that rock solid evidence. We don't have that. But we do have a lot of little pieces that kind of fit together and form a coherent picture. We have Jay's story. It's backed up by phone records. It's backed up by him knowing all sorts of details. He knows about the strangulation. He knows what she's wearing that day. How could he have known what Hae was wearing that day if he didn't see her body? Because he wasn't a student in this high school. So you just take all of these things together, and it feels like it's a pretty strong case.
Now, this is from Serial Season 1, Episode 6. The most incriminating piece of physical evidence against Adnan Syed was a fingerprint, or rather a palm print, on a map. It was one of those big map books you buy at a gas station. Police found it in the back seat of Hae's car. On the back cover was a partial print of Adnan's left palm. One page was ripped out from the map. At trial, they pointed out that it was the page that showed Leakin Park, where she was found. Let me ask you, Joseph Scott Morgan, how compelling is that evidence to you, number one? And number two, would you expect there to be more evidence inside that car?
Yeah, you would think, and let's go back in time, too, and begin to think about our capabilities back at that time in investigating, the interior of a car, looking for molecular DNA in that environment. We're far more ahead of the game at this point in time. So just the potential for DNA evidence within the cabin of that vehicle, I think, would, in today's context, would be much more evidence rich, if you will. The palm print is quite fascinating to me, because that would, you would begin to think about, how long had she, Miss Lee, been in possession within her vehicle of this map book. Who purchased the map book? How far back does it go? Because, there's an intimate connection between these two. And certainly as an investigator, you want to go down all of those roads to try to understand the provenance of this thing. It is, again, very compelling that one page that refers specifically to this park is absent. Essentially you take that piece away that you need, and you discard the rest. And in this case, perhaps it was left back there.
Our guests are staying with us. We're going to look at the other side of the coin. Still to come, what was the alleged exculpatory evidence?
Very close to a friend of mine named Hae Lee. She was murdered, and I was ultimately charged and taken to trial and wrongfully convicted of that crime.
One of the most successful true crime TV shows ever.
This is crazy.
Now has a new home on America's original true crime obsession, 48 Hours on Court TV. Coming up next on Court TV.
I think he was a ticking time bomb.
Chaos in a courtroom as a defendant goes after a judge.
And now faces a jury for attempted murder.
The Judge Jumper attempted murder trial begins this week, only on Court TV.
When the evidence exists to exonerate those that have been falsely accused and convicted, the public must know that the justice
An amazing moment. You had the prosecutor who was basically putting into motion everything necessary to set Adnan Syed free, and she's making her statement to the public, and in the middle of doing it, she gets upstaged because that's the moment that Adnan steps outside of the courthouse a free man for the first time since his conviction. An amazing moment there. Then a year later, Adnan Syed spoke and talked about his case and his thoughts about his case. I want you to take a listen.
We appreciate everybody's support over the past 24 years. Back in 1999, I was a 17-year-old high school student, and I was arrested and charged with a crime I didn't commit. A very close and dear friend of mine named Hae Lee, she was murdered, and I was ultimately charged and taken to trial and wrongfully convicted of that crime. And I would go on to I was sentenced to life in prison, and I would spend the next almost 24 years in prison. And it wasn't until recently, 1 year ago today, that I was actually released. We appreciate the fact that so many people have come forward to investigate this case and to use their resources to find out who's responsible for Hae's murder. For all these years, not just me proving my innocence, but that's been one of our biggest goals. We respect how much Hae's family has suffered because we know how much our family has suffered. And not just trying to prove that I'm innocent and to make it back home to my family, but to find justice for Hae and her family. That's always been one of our primary concerns as a family.
Okay, so he's talking about innocence here. He's not talking about not enough evidence to prove that I did it. He's saying my innocence, meaning I didn't do it. And the prosecutor at the time agreed. So that brings us to our next question, which is, what exactly was the alleged exculpatory evidence? The evidence showing that he didn't do it, that he was an innocent man wrongfully convicted. Still with me, co-hosts of the Murder Sheet podcast, Anya Kane and Kevin Greenlee, and also with us, forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I want to play something from the prosecutor for you, because I want your reaction, your take on what she said was some of this exculpatory evidence. Let's listen.
This morning, I instructed my office to dismiss the criminal case against Adnan Syed following the completion of a second round of touch DNA testing of items that were never tested before. Those items include skirt, pantyhose, shoes, and jacket of Miss Hae Min Lee. Although no DNA was recovered from the skirt, the pantyhose, or jacket swabs, there was a DNA mixture of multiple contributors on both Miss Lee's shoes. The same multiple contributor for both of Miss Lee's shoes. And most compellingly, Adnan Syed, his DNA was excluded.
Okay, Joseph, how compelling is this to you? The DNA, unknown mixed DNA on her shoes, but no DNA anywhere else on her, the victim of a strangulation. Does that tell you this was an innocent man?
No, it doesn't necessarily tell me it's an innocent man. Scientifically, it tells me that somebody else had contact with those shoes. And, when I begin to think about, how Miss Lee's body was deposited in that location, that's a perfect point of contact if you're talking about perhaps she was drugged to that location. So that, for me, from a scientific standpoint, is very compelling. You think about also, again, I don't want to keep going over the same ground, but this idea of touch DNA, this is a recent manifestation for us in the field of forensics. And not everybody to this point still has access to this type of technology. But just so folks understand, with touch DNA, just simply think about how many skin cells you slough daily. You might not be aware of it, but it's thousands. And so touch DNA is actually a partial of DNA. And so it transfers many times through dead skin cells onto these contact surfaces. And then, one of the things about this case, this is such an intimate event. We're not talking about some kind of shooting at a great distance. We're talking about somebody using their hands for the purpose of a manual strangulation. That really draws into question what else was maybe missed during the collection of evidence off of her body.
I want to show you this, Anya and Kevin. This is another significant part of the case. There's a woman named Asia McLean, and she wrote a letter on March 31st of 1999 to Adnan. I'm not sure if you remember talking to me in the library on January 13th, that's the day of the murder, but I remember chatting with you. I have reason to believe in your innocence. I also called the Woodlawn Public Library and found they have a surveillance system inside the building. Depending on the amount of time you spend in the library that afternoon, it might help in your defense. What's the story of Asia McLean and her connection here? And is there a reason why she shouldn't be believed?
Well, Adnan's defense attorneys at the time, they knew about Asia and they chose not to use her, apparently because they felt she had some credibility issues. It has been pointed out that when she discusses seeing Adnan at the library that day, for instance, she described some weather events that did not happen that day. They happened on another day, which suggests she very well could have confused 2 days. She also indicates that she was with her boyfriend and another person, and she says, they remember seeing you too, Adnan. But they don't. Those people have come forth and said, no, we don't remember seeing Adnan that day. So things like that, they sort of pile up and they call her credibility into question. And so perhaps his original defense attorneys just felt that she wouldn't have survived cross-examination. And I'd also wonder, if she saw him in the library that day, why didn't anyone else see him in the library that day? Not even the people she was with saw him in the library. Did anyone else see him in the library who could come forward and corroborate that story? If so, that might be convincing, but it hasn't happened.
Now, what's also interesting is that there was a hearing based upon this witness, this alibi witness, but she didn't show up to that hearing. Here's Adnan Syed talking about that.
So Asia McClain, unbeknownst to any of us, she's in another state somewhere across the country. She hears the audio of Kevin Urick. She listens to Serial, and for the first time ever, she hears the audio of Kevin Urick testifying falsely about their conversation. So she retains an attorney on her own, and she submits an affidavit to the court. And she affirms seeing me after school in the library on January 13th, 1999, that we had a conversation and that she left around 2:40 p.m., leaving me in the library. And she also stated that Kevin Urick discouraged her from attending the 2012 post-conviction hearing.
So Anya, this is an accusation against the prosecutor that he's trying to discourage a witness from testifying in court, a witness that could help the defendant. What are your thoughts on the way that all played out?
Absolutely, Vinnie. Yeah, in any case, that would be a very disturbing allegation. Given the fact that this is the same woman who wrote in a book about the case that she saw the ghost of Hae Min Lee, I tend to find this woman lacking in credibility to a certain extent. And so I don't know. I think if in a different case with a different witness and a different set of facts, I think we could look at that and scrutinize it. But in this situation, I think there's a lot of problems with Asia McClain and what she claims her role in this is. And so I'm not necessarily inclined to put a lot of weight on that.
Joseph Scott Morgan, we've said this goes back to 1999. We have about 30 seconds, 40 seconds here. How much different would this case have been originally if it happened today with cell phones, with forensics?
Oh, we'd have a much tighter picture, a much tighter focus. I think the technology has caught up at this point. My thought, kind of finishing up here, is that they claim that they have two other subjects in this. If the prosecutor's office was so energetic about prosecuting this man, let's see how energetic they are about revealing those names and following up with that case, perhaps doing genetic genealogy, going down the road to see, who is, because the most important person here is Miss Lee, and she's gone now. And so we fancy ourselves as those people that speak for the dead. That's who is important here. And we still have, he's been released, so there's still a killer or killers out there.
Absolutely. Joseph Scott Morgan, Anya Kane, Kevin Greenlee, thank you so much. For me, the most important question here is who murdered Hae Min Lee? That's the question. And there was a jury that answered that question at one point, but did they have all the information? Did they have enough information? I don't know if that's ever going to be answered, because this case really now is in the hands of prosecutors and judges. So I don't know if we'll ever find out, but we'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.